January 1940. London. Fog presses low against the lamps along Whitehall. Inside a wood-panelled briefing room, British officers stand over a map of Europe already bleeding red. Poland is gone, France is bracing. The Royal Navy patrols alone. Across the Atlantic, America watches. The United States is rich, vast, and distant, but, to many in this room, it feels irrelevant. Its army is small. Its tanks are outdated. Its soldiers untested. Notes are taken. Comments are made quietly, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with open doubt. "Unready," one officer mutters. "Unwilling," says another. Britain has been at war for months. America has not fired a shot. Outside, sirens cut through the night as German bombers cross the Channel. Britain braces itself to stand alone. In Washington, neutrality laws still bind hands. Factories are idle. Shipyards are quiet. Yet unseen, something enormous is beginning to stir. Not on the battlefield, but in steel mills, rail yards, and drafting offices. Not in speeches, but in production orders, measured in thousands. The men in this room cannot yet see it. But the war they are fighting will soon be drone not by bullets, but by American power arriving in waves. And when it does, everything will change. By early 1940, Britain's understanding of war had been shaped by memory and exhaustion. The First World War still cast a long shadow over every decision. British officers remembered mud, attrition, and the slow grind of industrial conflict, but they also remembered that Britain had endured it largely on its own terms, supported by empire, sea power, and experience. America, in contrast, was remembered for arriving late. In British military colleges, the lesson was quietly repeated. The United States joined the Great War only in its final years, inexperienced and dependent on Allied guidance. Its troops were brave, but green, its command structure slow, its contribution decisive only because the war was already bleeding Germany dry. That memory hardened into assumption. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain declared war immediately. America did not. President Franklin D. Roosevelt condemned aggression, but neutrality laws passed in the 1930s reflected a deep American reluctance to return to European war. Congress limited arms sales. Public opinion favored distance, not sacrifice. To British planners, this confirmed what they already believed. The British Army, though smaller than Germany's, was professional. The Royal Navy still ruled the seas. The Royal Air Force had proven itself capable during the early months of air combat. Britain had fought world wars before. America, once again, seemed hesitant. Even as France collapsed in May 1940, this perception barely shifted. When British troops evacuated Dunkirk, saving the core of the army, the moment was seen as proof of British resilience, not Allied failure. Britain stood alone, but standing alone was not new. Empire resources still stretched across continents. India, Canada, Australia, and Africa provided manpower and material. The Royal Navy ensured that Britain, though battered, remained supplied. America, meanwhile, remained officially neutral. From London's perspective, the United States looked like a giant that refused to wake. Its army ranked behind several European powers in size. Its tank force was negligible. Its aircraft production lagged behind Britain and Germany. Many American weapons were obsolete, leftovers from another era. British officers did not openly mock America in public statements, but privately, skepticism was common. Reports circulated comparing divisions, training standards, and combat readiness. American units were judged inexperienced, commanders untested, doctrine outdated. Even American industry, though vast, in theory, appeared slow to convert to war footing. Britain had already done so. By 1940, British factories were operating under constant pressure, producing fighters, bombers, and ships at maximum capacity. The country had reorganized its economy for survival. Rationing was accepted. Civil defense was normalized. War was no longer a possibility, it was a daily condition. Across the Atlantic, American factories still produced civilian cars and consumer goods. Assembly lines remained peacetime machines. Labor unions debated contracts, not quotas. Shipyards worked, but not yet. At wartime speed, 2 British observers. This confirmed the gap. The assumption was not that America lacked potential, but that potential would arrive too late to matter. Even Roosevelt's early gestures of support were viewed cautiously. The cash-and-carry policy allowed Britain to buy weapons, but only by paying up front and transporting them themselves. Britain was grateful but also aware of its dwindling gold reserves. This was not partnership, it was transaction. Behind closed doors, British planners asked difficult questions. Could Britain survive long enough for America to care? Would American politics ever allow full commitment? And if it did, could American forces actually fight a modern, mechanized war? These doubts were not irrational. They were rooted in history, observation, and urgency. Britain was fighting for survival now. America seemed focused on tomorrow. What British officers could not yet see was that America's delay was not inaction but preparation, and that the silence across the Atlantic concealed the early movement of something far larger than an army, a transformation that would soon redefine what power meant in modern war. What British officer misjudged was not America's will but its method. The United States did not rush toward war the way European powers had in 1914. It hesitated. It debated. It argued internally. 2 British observers under daily bombardment. This hesitation looked like weakness. In reality, it was the slow alignment of politics, industry, and society for a different kind of conflict, one measured not only in battles, but in output. Franklin D. Roosevelt understood something many European officers did not. Modern war would not be decided solely by tactics or courage. It would be decided by scale. Even while publicly constrained by neutrality, the American government began quietly preparing. Military budgets expanded. Industrial surveys were conducted. Production bottlenecks were identified. Factories that once built cars and refrigerators were mapped for conversion into tank and aircraft plants. Rail networks were studied. Port capacities measured. None of this was visible on a battlefield map. In September 1940, the Selective Training and Service Act became the first peacetime draft in American history. It passed narrowly, revealing deep divisions, but it marked a turning point. The U.S. Army began expanding from a small professional force into a mass army. Training camps appeared across the country. Millions of men entered uniforms for the first time. Still, Britain remained unconvinced. American soldiers trained with wooden rifles due to equipment shortages. Maneuvers revealed confusion and inexperience. Reports sent back to London noted poor coordination and amateur mistakes. 2 British officers hardened by Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain, these exercises seemed to confirm their doubts. What they missed was speed. By late 1940, American industrial production curves began bending sharply upward. Aircraft output surged. Shipbuilding contracts multiplied. Steel consumption rose at unprecedented rates. The United States was not matching Britain or Germany, it was preparing to surpass them. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 formalized this shift. No longer would Britain pay in gold, it no longer had. America would supply weapons, vehicles, food, fuel, and raw materials on a scale never seen before. Roosevelt described it simply: America would become the convoys crossing the Atlantic grew heavier. Crates stacked higher. New equipment arrived faster than British factories could replace losses. American-built trucks began appearing in British units. Food shipments stabilized civilian morale. Fuel supplies expanded operational reach. Yet Edmonton British officers often saw these deliveries as assistance, not transformation. The belief persisted that America would supply not lead. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, British strategic thinking shifted again. Now Germany faced a vast eastern front. Britain hoped the Red Army would absorb the main blow. America, still officially neutral, seemed further removed from direct combat. But American factories did not slow. They accelerated. Shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than German submarines could sink them. Aircraft plants standardized production lines, turning complexity into repetition. Logistics planning extended across oceans, not just continents. Where Britain optimized under scarcity, America optimized under abundance. This difference mattered. British power was based on experience and endurance. American power would be based on replacement of ships, planes, tanks, and men, faster than any enemy could destroy them. By late 1941, the Atlantic War was already tilting, not because of battles won, but because of tonnage moved. British officers were beginning to notice. Reports changed tone. The skepticism soft. The jokes stopped. Questions replaced assumptions. How quickly could American divisions deploy? How much equipment could be sustained overseas? How long could this output be maintained? They still did not fully grasp the answer. That realization would not come through reports or statistics, but through war itself, through moments when American power stopped being theoretical and began flooding into the conflict with overwhelming force. And when that moment arrived, it would leave no room for doubt. British officers measured armies by tradition and discipline. Regiments carried histories. Commanders carried reputations earned over decades. In 1940, America had little of this. Its soldiers lacked shared memory of war. Its officers lacked battlefield scars. To British eyes, this absence looked like fragility. But America compensated with numbers. Once mobilization began, the flow of manpower was relentless. Training camps expanded into small cities. Millions passed through standardized programs. While early American units stumbled, each failure produced revised manuals, corrected doctrine, and improved training cycles. Mistakes were not hidden, they were absorbed and fixed. British armies refined what already existed. American armies reinvented themselves in motion. By 1942, this difference became impossible to ignore. Where Britain struggled to replace losses, American formations arrived fresh, fully equipped, and numerically intact. Human endurance had limits. Human replacement did not. Britain treated industry as support for war. America treated industry as the war itself. British factories worked at maximum capacity, but within physical limits. Space was scarce. Bombing disrupted output. Skilled labor was finite. Every loss hurt. American industry functioned differently. It expanded horizontally. New plants appeared where none existed. Entire regions were reorganized around production. Automobile lines became tank lines. Refrigerator plants became aircraft factories. Output was simplified, standardized, and repeated. This was not elegance. It was dominance. Through volume, British officers were trained to admire precision. American factories delivered excess. Tanks were not just built, they were built faster than they could be destroyed. Ships were launched not to replace losses, but to overwhelm loss itself. War became arithmetic. And America controlled the numbers. British military culture respected logistics but rarely celebrated it. Supplies were something to be managed, conserved, rationed. Every gallon of fuel mattered. Every shell was counted. America rejected scarcity thinking. Its planners assumed waste and planned beyond it. Supply chains were designed to operate across oceans, through storms, under attack. Redundancy was built into everything. If one port failed, another compensated. If one convoy was sunk, 3 more followed. This mindset shocked British officers. American units trained to expect continuous fuel, food, ammunition, spare parts, everything arrived in bulk. Not just enough, but more than enough. It changed how battles could be fought. Tempo increased, risk tolerance rose. Operations expanded. The war stopped feeling fragile. And slowly, British commanders began to realize that this was not recklessness, it was confidence grounded in capacity. By the end of 1942, these 3 forces, manpower, production, and logistics, were no longer theoretical. They were present, visible, unavoidable. But the most difficult adjustment for Britain was still to come. Because American power was not only material, it was about to reshape command, strategy, and the balance of influence inside the Allied war itself, where power began to shift. British officers had been fighting since 1939. Their commanders were veterans of failure and Dunkirk, the Blitz, North Africa. Experience had made them cautious, methodical, and conservative with force. American commanders arrived without that weight. Early American operations exposed serious flaws. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, U.S. forces were outmaneuvered by experienced German units. British observers saw confirmation of every early doubt. Reports were blunt. Criticism was sharp. But something different happened next. The American response was immediate and systemic. Commanders were replaced. Doctrine was revised. Training programs were rewritten in weeks, not years. Lessons were distributed across the entire force. Mistakes became data. This speed of adaptation unsettled British leadership. Where British reforms were incremental, American reforms were sweeping. Authority was centralized, then redistributed. Promising officers rose quickly. Ineffective ones disappeared. The system did not protect seniority. Protected outcomes Wheaton-Mons. American units returned to the field stronger, more coordinated, and more confident. British officers began to notice not just improvement but acceleration. At first, Britain led and America followed. British officers held senior commands. British planning frameworks dominated early Allied strategy. American forces were integrated cautiously, often placed under British oversight. This balance did not last. As American troop numbers surged, command structures strained. Who led whom became a mathematical problem, not a political one. American formations increasingly outnumbered their British counterparts. American equipment supplied entire theaters. American logistics sustained operations that British planners could not have attempted alone. Influence followed contribution. By late 1943, American commanders were no longer junior partners. They shaped strategy, set priorities, and demanded operational control. Combined commands evolved not by agreement, but by necessity. British officers did not lose respect. They lost exclusivity. The war was no longer something Britain managed with assistance. It was something America powered. The most profound change was internal. British skepticism faded quietly. There were no formal acknowledgments, no apologies. Instead, behavior changed. Requests increased. Planning assumed American participation. Operations were delayed or accelerated based on American readiness. Confidence shifted from self-reliance to integration. British officers who once questioned American resolve now measured success by American arrival schedules. The Atlantic no longer felt like a barrier but a pipeline. The jokes stopped entirely. By the time Allied forces prepared for the largest amphibious operation in history, no serious British planner doubted whether America could deliver. The question was no longer if American power would arrive. It was how much, and how fast. And the answer to that question would define the war's turning point when American power did not merely assist, but flooded the battlefield so completely that the conflict's direction became irreversible when American power became impossible to ignore. By 1943, the war had entered a new phase but not yet a decisive one. Germany was retreating in the east, but still lethal. The Atlantic remained contested. Italy had fallen, yet Western Europe was untouched. Britain had survived, but survival was no longer the goal. Victory required something different. It required force on a scale that Europe alone could no longer generate. In Britain, the build-up began quietly, then visibly, then overwhelmingly. American troops arrived not in symbolic numbers, but in formations measured by the tens of thousands. Airfields expanded across southern England. New roads appeared almost overnight. Ports were reorganized. Villages filled with foreign accents. By early 1944, Britain was no longer merely an island under siege. It had become a staging ground for an invasion. British officers walked through camps where American divisions trained continuously. Equipment stood in endless rows: trucks, tanks, artillery, landing craft. Everything was standardized. Everything was replaceable. Loss was no longer feared in advance, it was planned for. This was new. The numbers alone were staggering. By spring 1944, over 2 million American personnel were stationed in the United Kingdom. Not advisors, not support staff, combat forces engineers, air crews, logisticians, and planners, each integrated into a single operational vision. Operation Overlord was not just an amphibious assault, it was the physical expression of American scale. British planners had imagined a return to the continent for years. They had drawn maps, debated beaches, refined tactics. What they lacked was mass. What America provided was excess. Landing craft were the clearest symbol. Britain could design them. America could build them by the thousands. Where earlier plans had been constrained by shipping limits, Overlord expanded until the limits themselves were redefined. The invasion timetable was set not by courage but by inventory. American factories supplied more than assault forces. They supplied redundancy. If a beach failed, another could absorb pressure. If losses mounted, replacements were already in transit. If weather delayed operations, stockpiles waited patiently. British officers understood then what had changed. This was no longer a gamble. On June 6, 1944, the invasion began. British forces landed with discipline and experience. Canadian units fought with precision, but it was the American beaches Utah and Omaha that revealed the true nature of the shift. At Omaha, American units were cut down under intense fire. The landing nearly failed. British observers feared the worst, yet instead of collapse, pressure increased. More men landed, more equipment followed. Firepower intensified. Losses were absorbed in a hidden, not denied, but overwhelmed by continuation. The assault did not stop, because it could not. This was not brilliance in the traditional sense. It was endurance made industrial. By nightfall, Allied forces held ground across Normandy. The bridgehead was fragile. It existed, and behind it stood an ocean not of water, but of soup. For British officers watching the operation unfold, doubt finally disappeared. The Americans were not just fighting well. They were fighting endlessly. And this was only the beginning, because once the beachheads were secured, American power did not slow. It multiplied, pushing inland, expanding air superiority, flooding France with men, machines, and momentum. The war had reached its irreversible point. When the flood became a force, no enemy could resist after Normandy. The war did not pause. It accelerated. What followed was not a series of isolated battles, but a sustained surge on operational tempo that Germany could not match, and Britain could not have achieved alone. American power now moved with momentum, not preparation. The breakout from Normandy in late July 1944 revealed the full effect of scale. Operation Cobra was not elegant. It was overwhelming. Bombers flattened German positions. Armored divisions punched through gaps, widened by sheer firepower. Where earlier offensives relied on precision, this one relied on pressure. And pressure did not stop. American units advanced with a confidence built on certainty of resupply. Fuel flowed forward through pipelines laid behind advancing troops. Ammunition arrived faster than it could be expended. Damaged vehicles were replaced, not repaired in place. The front did not wait. British officers watching the advance across France noted the difference immediately. German resistance was not tactically inferior. It was materially exhausted. Units fought bravely, then simply ran out of everything. The imbalance grew daily. By August 1944, Paris was liberated. By September, Allied forces reached the German border. The speed of the advance stunned even its planners. This was not traditional maneuver warfare. It was sustained dominance. Even when the advance slowed at supply choke points, at fortified lines, the underlying advantage remained. The Allies did not pause because they were defeated. They paused because their logistics momentarily lagged behind their own success. That problem was solved the American way. The Red Ball Express turned roads into light. Thousands of trucks moved continuously, day and night, carting fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts. Drivers slept in their seats. Maintenance followed behind. Losses were replaced. The system absorbed strain rather than breaking under it. British logisticians, experienced and disciplined, were impressed and unsettled. This was not efficiency born of scarcity. It was resilience born of surplus. When Germany launched its final major offensive in December 1944, the result was revealing. The Ardennes attack caught Allied forces by surprise. American units bore the initial shock. Losses were heavy. Conditions were brutal. Yet the response was decisive. American reserves moved immediately. Air power returned once weather cleared. Supplies flowed despite snow and chaos. The German offensive burned out, not because it lacked courage, but because it lacked endurance. By early 1945, the balance was absolute. American divisions crossed the Rhine in strength. Bridges were replaced as fast as they were destroyed. Rivers no longer delayed advance, they became obstacles to be engineered away. The Western Front ceased to be a contest of maneuver and became a march. British officers no longer questioned American capability. They measured victory in American time. By the time Allied forces met Soviet armies on the Elbe, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The war's end was a matter of time, not possibility. What had begun as skepticism in a London briefing room in 1940 had ended in acceptance, quiet, unspoken, and complete. American power had not arrived dramatically. It had flooded the war until resistance simply disappeared beneath it. What the flood left behind. When the fighting slowed in the spring of 1945, the landscape of Europe told a clear story. Cities lay shattered. Rail lines twisted. Armies stood exhausted at the edges of collapse. But beneath the visible destruction lay a deeper transformation, one that British officers understood immediately. The war they had entered in 1939 no longer existed. The balance of power within the Allied victory had shifted decisively. Britain emerged, proud, proven, and resilient, but also drained. 6 years of total war had consumed manpower, industry, and empire resources. The country had survived through discipline and sacrifice, but survival had come at a cost that could not be hidden. America emerged different. The United States ended the war with its industrial base, not ruined, but expanded. Its factories were larger than before, its workforce more skilled, its logistics networks global, its armed forces numbered in the millions, battle-hardened and fully supplied. British officers reviewing post-war assessments did not need political analysis to understand the implications. Numbers spoke clearly. The United States had produced roughly half of the world's industrial output by 1945. It had built hundreds of thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of tanks, and millions of vehicles. Its shipyards had launched fleets that still dominated the seas. Its supply systems had spanned oceans without collapsing. Britain, by contrast, had optimized under constraint. That contrast shaped the aftermath. In liberated Europe, American supplies fed civilians. American trucks moved relief. American engineers rebuilt bridges. American dollars followed American material. Even where British influence remained strong, it now operated alongside American capacity, not ahead of it. This was not humiliation. It was reality. British military leadership adapted quickly. Post-war planning assumed American partnership as permanent, not temporary. Defense strategies were rewritten around alliance structures rather than imperial reach. Experience remained Britain's strength, but scale had become America's domain. The war had proven something uncomfortable but undeniable. Courage and experience could win battles, but industrial depth could decide wars. As reports circulated through British institutions, the early skepticism of 1940 felt distant, almost irrelevant. No one recorded apologies. No officer formally revised old remarks. There was no need. The outcome had answered every doubt, and yet the most lasting consequence of America's wartime flood was not measured in factories or formations. It was measured in how power itself was now understood. Because after 1945, no major war plan anywhere in the world could be written without assuming American involvement, whether as ally, supplier, or determinant force. The war had ended, but its lesson was just beginning to settle. How doubt turned into dependence. In the months following victory, British officers reflected less on what had gone wrong, more on what had been revealed. The early doubts about America were not entirely misplaced. In 1939 and 1940, the United States truly was unready for modern war. Its army had been small, its doctrine incomplete, its public divided. What Britain had misjudged was not America's starting point, but its trajectory. Once mobilized, the United States had not merely caught up. It had redefined the scale at which war could be fought. British officers came to understand that America's greatest weapon had not been a tank, a bomber, or a general, but its ability to convert time into power. Every month of delay in 1940 and 1941 had multiplied output later. Every early mistake had accelerated learning. Every loss had been replaced faster than it could shape strategy. This realization shaped the post-war military world. Alliances shifted from necessity to structure. NATO was not built on sentiment, it was built on arithmetic. American power underwrote collective defense. British experience provided wisdom and continuity. The roles were complementary, but no longer equal in scale. Within Britain's military institutions, training reflected this truth. Officers studied American logistics as carefully as German tactics. War colleges analyzed production curves alongside battle maps. Future conflict was no longer imagined as a test of endurance alone, but as a competition of systems. The psychological shift endured. British officers no longer asked whether America would act. They asked how quickly it could move and how much it could deliver. Dependence did not imply weakness, it implied realism. The early skepticism faded into anecdote, a memory of a different era, a reminder of how Israeli power can be misunderstood when measured by the wrong yardstick. By the time the Cold War began, the lesson was fixed. The modern world would not be shaped solely by those who fought first, but by those who could sustain the fight longest, at the greatest scale, without collapse. In 1940, British officers had judged America by its silence. By 1945, silence had been replaced by certainty. American power had not shouted its arrival. It had arrived in waves, steady, unstoppable, and decisive. And once the flood began, the course of the war and the world could no longer be what the flood ultimately meant. History rarely announces its turning points clearly. In early 1940, British officers judged America by what they could see. A distant nation, slow to act, hesitant to fight, seemingly unprepared for the kind of war already consuming Europe. Their doubts were logical, their skepticism grounded in experience. What they could not see was scale forming quietly behind distance. The Second World War proved that modern conflict is not decided only by bravery or brilliance. It is decided by the ability to endure pressure without breaking, to lose and replace, to fail and adapt, to spend and still continue. America did not enter the war as a finished military power. It entered as a system capable of becoming one faster than any enemy could respond. British officers learned this not through theory, but through necessity. Through convoys that never stopped arriving, through divisions that kept coming ashore, through losses that did not halt momentum. What began as assistance became inevitability. This was not a story of embarrassment or decline. Britain's role remained essential. Experience, resilience, and early sacrifice held the line when few others could. But the war revealed a deeper truth. In the industrial age, victory belongs to those who can transform potential into sustained force. American